The session is chaired by Manoj Pandey. Dr. Pandey is a lecturer in economics at the Development Policy Center at Crawford School of Economics in ANU, working in Port Moresby as part of ANU-UPNG Partnership Program. Prior to joining ANU, he worked as a fellow in Official Statistics and coordinator for Official Statistics Program at the School of Economics, the Faculty of Business and Economics at the USP. Dr. Pandey has a strong background in statistics, applied econometrics, and economics. And apart from his recent interests in Pacific economy, his research work includes issues in development economics. Dr. Pandey?
Thank you, Ben. So today's session is on regional trade and export competitiveness. This is a very important topic for the entire world, but most importantly for the Pacific economies. This topic, the export competitiveness comes from the production, and in the first year economics we teach about the comparative advantage. So if a country has comparative advantage, means that lower opportunity cost in producing something, they are more competitive and they can produce, they can export. However, there are many factors that affect trade, and if we use standard gravity kind of framework, size of the countries matter, and so size of the country can be measured through their size, their population, their GDP, and then the next comes is the investment from outside, so that they can produce more. But these are the internal and external factors. Apart from this, one of the important factor that involves trade is the distance between partner countries, and it's not only geographical distance matters, but also political distance, which is very, very important. So there are so many countries which are very near in terms of the distance, in terms of the geographical distance, but they are actually very far in terms of the political distance. And one of the great example you can see, unfortunately, is my country, India and Pakistan. They are neighbors, but there is huge difference, huge distance in terms of the, if you talk about the trade. But there are other examples in the world, like China and Taiwan. They have political differences, but they are good trade partners. So political distance, geographical distance matters, and then it comes to your domestic trade policies towards your partners, in terms of like tariffs, in terms of the diplomacy, your international relations, your exchange rate policies, which is very important, driver for the export. And then today's topic comes with the regional partnership. You have bilateral, you can have multilateral, you can have regional, so like ASEAN, G20, G8, under WTO agreements with any country. So there can be various forms of regional and multilateral cooperations. Of course, common language, shared history, and international relations matters. But what more matters from country's point of view is ease of doing business, which especially is very important in Pacific region. And I was looking at the ease of doing survey, and I found that it is still very hard to do business in the Pacific countries. Every country has their own limitations, but I think today's session is going to provide some sort of insights, so that regional cooperation can be improved and trade can be improved. So ultimately the aim is to aim is to improve the human capital and the quality of life in the Pacific region. In today's session, we have 3 speakers. The first speaker is Veniana Qalo. She is Trade Policy Advisor in the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, PIFS. She will be speaking on an update on bilateralism and development, emerging trade patterns in the Pacific. Just to introduce her, Veniana was recently appointed as Trade Policy Advisor at the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, where since January 2014 she has been responsible for the provision of technical advice and assistance to members countries on trade policy issues. Prior to 2004, she worked for almost 6 years in PIPS as a research assistant and trade policy officer before joining the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, where she held a position of economic advisor for more than 9 years until 2013. She was concurrently the acting head of section and economic advisor, International Trade and Regional Cooperation, ITRC section, Economic Affairs Division from 2012 to 2013, a registered barrister and solicitor in Fiji, which is very uncommon for trade experts. She holds a Bachelor of Law degree and a professional diploma in legal practice from the University of the South Pacific, a Master in Business Administration from Birkbeck University in London, and a Master's in International Law and Economics, magna cum laude from the World Trade Institute, Joint University of Neuchâtel, Freiburg and Bern in Switzerland. Ms. Qalo has written and published pieces of a range of trade and international law issues. Welcome, Veniana. The next speaker is Wesley Morgan. He is currently lecturer at the University of the South Pacific. And in his presentation today, he will be asking question if marginalization postponed, the trade negotiations in the Pacific Islands. He is a lecturer in politics and international affairs at the School of Government Development and International Affairs at the University of the South Pacific. Prior to joining USP, he was Pacific Policy Advisor with Oxfam. He has written widely on contemporary issues in the Pacific, including the politics of regional cooperation, Pacific engagement in the regional and global trade negotiations, Pacific Island diplomacy, climate change, human rights, the future of agriculture in the Pacific, and leadership and governance in Vanuatu, among other topics. And our final speaker, so welcome Wesley. And our final speaker is Benjamin Radoc. So it is my, like you introduced me and I am going to introduce you. Many of you who have attended this session, he is constantly here. He will be talking about evolving trade and economic linkages between the Pacific and Asia. Benjamin is a member of the economics team in ADB headquarters that assists in economic and fiscal monitoring of Pacific developing member countries. He has several years of experience as economist in the area of asset management, national planning, and poverty analysis, and project manager Six Sigma and technical assistance. He completed graduate programs in economics at the University of Philippines, Kiel Institute for the World Economy in Germany in advanced studies, and University of East Anglia in the UK, where he completed his PhD. So welcome, Benjamin. Now, just to emphasize, by the time you know the rules for the session, this session is for 1.5 hours. Every speaker will be given 15 minutes. Our student volunteer will be, keeping time straight. Because yesterday I actually went long beyond, the time that was given to me. But a great person always learns from their own mistakes and implement on others, right? So I'm going to implement that, lessons from that mistake on our speakers. So be on time, but don't panic. We will consider. So I will, with that, I will invite, and this session will be. So, and after the presentations, we will have a question answer session at the end. So I will invite our first speaker, Veniana. Welcome.
Good morning to you all. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I must say it was quite an adventure coming in. I had studied here at USP, but it took me half an hour to actually find this room. So I'm also quite excited to see quite a lot of familiar faces here in the room, and I certainly hope that the aspects that I will be sharing with you on the topic today will be an intellectually stimulating one. I'd like to take this opportunity to also thank the Asian Development Bank, the University of the South Pacific, and the Australian National University for the kind invitation that was extended to us, which has facilitated my ability to be here with you today. I've heard a preliminary introduction about what the session is supposed to be about, and I was requested to nuance my presentation accordingly. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those people who like to follow the rules. So today, the focus of my presentation is really going to be on these issues. As controversial as they are, I do believe that this is a topic that requires some debate and also some analysis, particularly on how it will have an impact on the non-parties like the Pacific Island countries. So in terms of context, the first question that I will try and tackle today is the mega FTAs. How is it defined? And what are the specific mega FTAs that I will be focusing on today, despite the time limitations that I have been provided. And then speak a little bit about the impact of the potential impact of the mega blocks on trade and investment of third countries, including the Pacific small vulnerable economies as they're defined or as they're referred to at the WTO negotiations, and also the least developed country members. And in this regard, I will be focusing on these specific issues, the impact on, in terms of preference erosion, the rules of origin, particularly accumulation, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, trade in services, intellectual property rights, investment, and then I will conclude with some strategic policy recommendations for Pacific Island countries. Mega FTAs, so how are they defined? I've looked at a couple of literature to try and conglomerate an acceptable definition. And this is what I've managed to come up with. It's an agreement that is negotiated by 3 or more countries or a regional grouping, whose members collectively account for around 25% of world merchandise trade, and also substance of which goes beyond the current World Trade Organization disciplines. So the focus of my presentation will be the potential impact of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the TTIP, as well as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements on the Pacific Island countries. So for those of you that might not be familiar about what these acronyms are about, perhaps I could provide you with some background information in terms of the membership and geopolitical importance of some of these mega trading blocks. So the EU-US Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement, referred to here as the TTIP, it comprises economies which represents about the largest economic relationships in the world. So they account for around 30% of global merchandise trade and about 40% of world trading services, and nearly half of global GDP. In terms of investment in 2011, the European investment in the United States accounted for around 70% of total foreign direct investment in the US, and European investment to the US was 7 times larger than those to China. And it's also important to note at this juncture that there is currently a negotiation as well that is ongoing between the EU and China on a bilateral investment treaty, and also the EU and the US. The potential implications of these negotiations in terms of Brexit is probably another subject of discussion. So in terms of the global GDP and trade shares of these two mega trading blocs, the figure is there before you, which basically means that these two mega trading blocs comprise countries that are going to be geopolitically powerful, economically powerful, and also the structure of the agreements or the standards, high standards in the agreement are likely to have an impact on the future world trade architecture. For those that might not be familiar with what TPP is, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement currently includes 12 countries, and that's Australia, Brunei, Darussalam, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, the US, and Vietnam. It's important to note in terms of the two agreements. I'll be focusing in particular on the two, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the RCEP agreements, for two specific reasons. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement has been touted to be a US-led initiative, and the RCEP has been touted to be a China, Japan-led initiative, which was to a certain extent a reaction by the two countries to the US-led TPP. But the key question that now arises in the Asia-Pacific region is which particular model will be utilized to prepare the groundwork for the establishment of an APEC-wide agreement that would, such as what is referred to now as the Free Trade Agreement of the Asia-Pacific region. So this is one of the key questions that is now arising, and will potentially be a subject that would be on the agenda of the upcoming APEC high-level meeting in 2018 in PNG. So the key question is, if the TPP prepares the ground for the establishment of an APEC-wide agreement, then in the long term, the implementation of the comprehensive TPP may be more significant than the TTIP. The Obama administration are actually looking at the agreement in terms of the potential implications of the standards that this particular agreement is going to set. And if it's going to gain traction, then the economic benefit for the US is going to be large, in the realms of about 300 trillion. So such an agreement would see the establishment of one of the largest FTAs incorporating China, Japan, and the US, along with a number of fast-growing Asia and Pacific countries, and will also have repercussions for the rest of the world. What is the link between the two for the Pacific Forum Island countries? Well, apart from the trade linkages that some of the Pacific Island countries have with the TPP or the RCEP parties, Australia and New Zealand are parties to the TPP, but also negotiating the RCEP. So one of the questions that is arising here in the region is whether or not the high standards that are in those agreements would potentially be reflected in some of the bilateral trade agreements or the regional trade agreements that are currently being negotiated. But as I speak on this particular issue from here on, I take off my hat as a representative of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and I must inform that these are basically my own personal research, and so no attribution will be made to the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat or its member governments. So the TPP, the TTIP, and the RCEP. The TPP negotiations that I had mentioned earlier on were energized by the participation of the US in September 2008. So the US participation became the catalyst for other Asia-Pacific states to join the TPP negotiations, so it gained traction. And it gained further momentum when the Obama administration made it the centerpiece of its new trade policy and its new economic pivot to Asia, or what is referred to in the U.S. administration as a strategic imbalance of U.S. foreign policy priorities to the Asia-Pacific region. So this is an approach that entails deeper diplomatic, economic, and security engagements with Asia-Pacific countries, i.e., it's larger than trade. So the question that arises at this juncture as well, perhaps from a geopolitical standpoint, is the alliance of the countries that are negotiating the TPP vis-a-vis those that are aligning themselves with the RCEP negotiations, which is a China-led initiative. So the primary goal of RCEP is to consolidate the trade systems in East Asia, combining the 5 ASEAN plus FTAs into a single agreement. And the RCEP has received strong backing from China, which leads many to view, as I mentioned earlier on, that it's China's counterweight to the US-led TPP. So both the TPP and the RCEP that I've mentioned could potentially be building blocks for an FTAP in the Asia-Pacific region. One of the questions that's currently lingering here in the Pacific is a conduit through which the Pacific Island, the Forum Island countries is going to engage in this huge consolidation process that's occurring in the Asia-Pacific region. Will it be through ACTA, which is a UNESCAP-driven initiative, or will it be through APEC, and one which only PNG, Australia, and New Zealand are members of? And will the PACER Plus be a conduit through which the region negotiates or links itself economically or trade-wise with the members of the parties that are part of the consolidation process. So the TPP was signed on 4th February 2016 in Auckland, and there's never been a dull moment since. So what are the impact of global mega blocks and trade and investment in third countries? As was mentioned earlier on by the eminent chairperson, the focus really should be about how this will have an impact on the export competitiveness of the Forum Island countries, and also in terms of its exports. I think one thing is important to understand is the regional schematics or the regional structures that exist, and one through which the Pacific Forum Island countries or the Pacific Forum members engage with the parties that are currently, those parties to the TPP or those that are currently negotiating the RCEP. So in terms of the impact, I'll just focus on two specific effects. The first is a direct effect that the mega regional agreements can have on existing outsider country access to the EU and US market on preferential terms. And here I'm just focusing on the EU and US market. There are also other preferential or non-reciprocal trade agreements that also, or trade arrangements that also exist between some of the Forum Island countries and the TPP parties. The second channel is the impact of the reduction of the non-tariff measures and the harmonization of standards such as SPS and TBT within the mega regional agreements can have on either raising or reducing the export costs for outsider countries. So this is just a schematic to make the previous slide a little bit more beautiful and a bit more visionary. So several of the Pacific, if we were to come back and nuances in terms of some of the practical specifics in the Pacific Island countries, so several Pacific LDCs and small states have strong linkages with the TPP and RCEP in view of the presence of the members of the two agreements among the top 5 export destination and import sources of the LDCs and small states. So the LDCs and the small vulnerable economies with shares of around 10% or more of merchandise trade with TPP and RCEP blocks are as follows. For the TPP, the LDCs that have shares of 10% or more of merchandise trade with the TPP parties. In the Pacific, that includes Samoa, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. In the RCEP, the Pacific LDCs include Samoa, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu again. And for the small vulnerable economies, a definition that is utilized in the WTO negotiation fora. For the TPP, it's Fiji and Tonga. And for RCEP, again, it's Fiji and Tonga. So the LDCs and small vulnerable economies with shares of, well, I've mentioned this earlier on. So in terms of the specific countries, if we were to summarize the potential impact of the TPP and what could potentially come out of our RCEP for these small vulnerable economies and LDCs in the Pacific, then we are specifically looking at Samoa, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Tonga, who have 10% or more trade with the TPP members. The RCEP also absorbs around 10% or more of trade with Samoa, Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Tonga. So Samoa, Solomons, Fiji, and Tonga have strong trade links with both blocs. So trade dependence of these SVEs and Pacific SVEs and LDCs on key TPP and RCEP members, and to large Asia-Pacific economies common to both, i.e. Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, will influence their trade linkages with the two regional trade agreements. If I'm going too fast, please tell me to slow down. I'm just weary about the time frame that has been impressed upon me by the chair. So these linkages are also influenced by non-reciprocal preferential access extended by the above-mentioned TPP and RCEP members. So when I talk about these terms, I think at this juncture it's important for us to try and simplify things a little bit. So when we talk about reciprocal preferential access, what we're actually talking about are free trade agreements. So when we talk about non-reciprocal preferential access, what we're talking about the likes of GSP, so EBA, everything but arms scheme. So it's a unilateral non-reciprocal preference that is provided by the developed or developing countries. So in terms of the impact pathways, first I'd like to focus on the preference erosion impact. So for the above-named Pacific LDCs and small states, the potential tariff preference erosion from TPP and RCEP could be significant, since several members of the two RTAs, EU, Australia, Canada, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, and the US, grant them non-reciprocal preference either at the bilateral or the regional level. For those of you that are interested in knowing about what these GSP schemes are, I have a paper. I'm not at liberty of sharing it at the moment. But we will have an arrangement to have this available publicly at some point in time in the future. So some of these specific countries have strong trade links with TPP and RCEP that can suffer great erosion, with several tariff lines becoming MFN, i.e. most favored nation or duty-free. So Fiji, as a sugar exporting state, would be worried of a preference erosion occurring in this regard. It's also important to note that on another front, Fiji's sugar export to the European Union, particularly to Tate and Lyle, which is in the UK, would also be subject to the removal of the production quotas that has been applicable and for which Fiji has enjoyed preferential access into the sugar market for, and this is going to disappear in 2017. But that's an aside. So around 5,000 items on which the LDCs in AGOA and Sibera beneficiaries enjoy preferential access into the US market would be eliminated, and this would imply significant preference erosion for the former. It also raises significant concerns regarding the value of the preference that Pacific ACP states could derive from PIFS US Development-Oriented Trade Investment Agreement, which is currently being discussed between some of the Forum Island countries and the US for concessions on selected exports into the US markets such as fisheries and apparels. It's important to note at this juncture that these are the same items for which LDCs, AGOA, and Sibera beneficiaries have been enjoying preferential access also into the US market. And these particular countries are therefore likely to be affected by significant preference erosion. The rules of origin. So if the rules of origin in TPP and RCEP confine preferential tariff benefits only to products that are manufactured or that are assembled entirely in the geographical domains of the parties, particularly if TPP and RCEP members do not avail of preferential benefits on externally sourced inputs, this could have a huge impact on the Pacific Island countries that would wish to enter the TPP and RCEP value chains. These are the SPS and TPT measures that are applied by the RCEP and TPP members. And one of the cases that has been raised in particular is that one of many SPS by the TPP parties have specifically affected some of the LDCs and SPE exports. And one in particular is New Zealand's SPS measures on imports of cabbage leaves from Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. Trading services, the information is there, is provided there before you. But what is, however, can be gleaned from the GATS commitments in these agreements is that they are GATS plus. In intellectual property rights, in advanced rules on intellectual property than those in TRIPS. And one of the issues that is currently arising is the time frame that is provided for patent I think that one of the key issues really on access to medicinal or drugs, pharmaceutical products. And on investment, some of the issues that have been raised is with the liberalization of some of the sectors of investment. One of the issues that have been raised is that it could generally improve investment conditions amongst the parties to mega regionals. Those are the other two bullet points. I leave the strategic policy recommendations here before you for your consideration, given that I've already been given the due notice.
So that's
Thank you.
So, Wesley?
Morning. Thank you, Vinny. The global trade regime is a very complex place, and I don't envy your job trying to help Pacific Island countries to understand the implications of things like these mega free trade agreements amongst large sections of the globe. I wanted to talk today to some research that I have undertaken as part of my doctoral research. I did my doctorate exploring regional trade negotiations in the Pacific. I've continued on that work for some publications, one I'm working on at the moment for the Journal of Pacific History, but also I should just say that I'm with the School of Government, Development and International Affairs here at the University of the South Pacific, and we have a brand new book out in 2016 which looks at the new Pacific diplomacy, and I have a chapter in here that looks at the Pacific's trade diplomacy. And I understand the book's only available for sale in Fiji, so if you're visiting, go down to the bookshop and get yourself one. So what will I be talking about today? I wanted to take a step back from the minutiae of the legal text of free trade agreements and have a bit of a think about the Pacific's engagement with the global trade regime in the post-colonial period, which is a very big topic, but I'll try and cover it in a succinct way and hopefully bring it to a point, because I think it is relevant for us today. For example, the Pacific Island countries are negotiating with Australia and New Zealand a new regional trade agreement, PACER Plus. The negotiations are at a very pointed end, and so how did we get here is part of the aim of my discussion. So I want to talk a little bit about post-colonial trade regimes in the Pacific from the period of independence up to the formation of the WTO, which really saw this strengthened global trade regime and its implications for the post-colonial preference arrangements in the Pacific, and then look at the 20 years following the formation of the WTO. So how did the Pacific respond to those changes? So that's the focus for the discussion. So post-colonial trade regimes in the Pacific were negotiated at independence, and the regional arrangements with metropolitan countries, usually former colonial powers. Ratumara, Fiji's first Prime Minister, was key to the negotiation of the Suva Protocol to the Lome Convention with the European Union, negotiated in 1975, which was really crucial for continuing the preferential arrangements that support Fiji's sugar industry. So for well over a century, sugar has been crucial for the Fijian economy. It's the raison d'etre for a number of sugar towns all around Fiji. And the Sugar Protocol ensured a continuation of those arrangements that would allow for the sugar industry to continue in Fiji. Spartica, the South Pacific Regional Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement with Australia and New Zealand, similarly offered preferential access to Australia and New Zealand for Pacific exports, and this proved important and allowed for the expansion of some manufacturing exports from the Pacific, most notably for the development of textiles, clothing, footwear industry in Fiji, which exploded during the late 80s and 90s, which was largely an offshoring of the textile industries from Australia and New Zealand to Fiji, and a car parts factory in Samoa. So that's limited manufacturing exports that expanded under these post-colonial regimes. So they were important for key commodities and for some expansion of trade. So what happened when the WTO was formed? Well, the WTO saw a strengthening of the global trade regime disciplines. So previous to the WTO, of course, we had the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and this saw that the Pacific's preferential access to metropolitan markets contravened the non-discriminatory application of rules under the global trade regime. So if the European Union was offering its ex-colonies above world prices for sugar, this contravened the principle of non-discrimination amongst allied countries, for example. We also saw, as well as the strengthening of the legal regime itself, we saw a move amongst developed countries towards free trade and towards lowering their own tariffs, and acceptance of neoclassical economics and the purported benefits to those states of having free markets meant that they were lowering their tariffs to competitors to Pacific Island countries. And what this meant was that the competitive disadvantages of island-based production were brought into sharper relief. So things that have been talked about at this conference, for example, yesterday during the World Bank report on Pacific Possibles, they were talking about what makes Pacific Island countries really unique in economic terms are these distance from markets, small domestic markets, high costs of inputs and transport. I mean, if any of you have thought about Pacific economies, you've heard this over and over again. It's this refrain about what's unique about Pacific economies. But what it means is that the long-run trend is that Pacific Island countries faced marginalisation in an increasingly liberalised global economy. There's this increasing acceptance that there is likely to be a permanent wedge in the cost of production in the Pacific and the world price in manufacturing and services, making it difficult to compete in all but a few niche markets. We heard from the presenters yesterday at the World Bank report on Pacific Possibles, but this just means that the usual prescriptions for export-led growth need to be rethought in a Pacific context. So how did the Pacific respond to this sort of long-run trend and the changes in the global regime itself? So Pacific states over the last 20 years have sought recognition of their unique trading circumstances, have actively sought exemptions from global trade rules in order to allow for metropolitan states to continue to offer preferential arrangements to island states given their unique trading circumstances. Pacific Island countries have argued unique policy solutions are needed that might replicate the effects of market preferences without replicating market distortions in Pacific economies. So, if the sugar industry in Fiji was effectively a subsidy to Fiji for a century, how do you replicate the effects of those preferences in other ways that are still, that don't necessarily contravene the regime, but the global trade regime, but may require innovation in rules? Pacific Island countries have sought aid to develop new industries, have sought preferential access to developed country markets. We heard yesterday Stephen Howes from the Development Policy Centre making a keen argument that Australia in particular should offer preferential access to its labour markets for Pacific Island countries. Pacific Island countries have argued that countries like Australia and New Zealand should review their quarantine restrictions that limit Pacific agricultural exports, and as Vinny well knows, should loosen their rules of origin requirements to allow for an expanded manufacturing sector. Particularly, this has been a long-standing issue for Fiji for textile exports. So briefly, negotiations at the WTO, the Pacific Islands Forum established a permanent delegation in Geneva, so the island countries could take stock of what's happening in the multilateral negotiations and put forward their own case. Again, they emphasised the special circumstances of the island states. And in the mid-90s, there was all this discourse about the small and the unique vulnerabilities of small island states. So within the United Nations, more broadly, this was considered in Barbados in 1994. There was a global conference on small island developing states. And this provided the sort of intellectual framework that Pacific Island countries took to the WTO and said, we are small and vulnerable economies, you should consider a separate category of states for us that would allow for these sorts of unique solutions and exemptions from some of the rules. The members agreed that they would establish a work program for small and vulnerable economies. This is why, by the way, the SVEs that Vinny was talking about in the categories of states before, how that came about. But members said, no new category of states. So it was a fairly limited concession. The WTO agreed to establish a work program for small and vulnerable economies, but this has had limited impact. I think that the states felt that regime compliance was more important than creating a new category of states for what in the global community is a small group of states. And we've seen over the last decade, Pacific Island countries continue to face very onerous demands in their WTO accession negotiations, which has led to almost absurdist outcomes, with countries like Vanuatu having to implement new intellectual property offices, and countries like Samoa having to lift their bans on meat offcuts from the United States when the United States trade negotiators demanded it. I just point out here that one of the sort of intellectual bastions that supported this trade diplomacy from the Pacific was Professor Roman Grimberg was an economist here at USP in the mid-90s and was the first multilateral trade policy advisor at the Pacific Islands Forum, and no doubt Vinny knows him well. And he's written a good book on the issues about Pacific Island countries in the WTO. Negotiations so that's at the global level. And at the regional level, this negotiation with metropolitan powers. So, as I said, the global rules meant the arrangements with Europe and with Australia and New Zealand contravened those rules, so they needed to be revisited. But it was very much also in their interest that those rules be revisited. So the European Union, for example, saw the strengthened global trade regime as an opportunity to revisit its post-colonial trading relationships with all of its ex-colonies and to negotiate regime-compliant FTAs. So it said, okay, what we'll do is we'll negotiate economic partnership agreements with countries in Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific. So they started a round of negotiations with 81 countries all at once. And so the Pacific got wrapped up into this with regional negotiations for an economic partnership agreement that were launched in 2004. Again, Pacific officials emphasised their unique trading disadvantages. They argued for unique solutions. But by and large, the European negotiators, who were negotiating with 81 countries at once, didn't listen to what the Pacific was saying. They were more interested in regime compliance, so they wanted the Pacific Island countries to sign up to a WTO-compatible reciprocal free trade agreement. And they also had their own regime-wide interests, so they wanted to introduce new things in the EPA negotiations that they wanted to see at the multilateral level that had nothing to do with the Pacific at all. If they had any real hard economic interests in the Pacific, it was around access to the Pacific's tuna fisheries. And the negotiations, the extremely short version is that Fiji and Papua New Guinea, under duress, signed an interim economic partnership agreement with the European Union in 2007 to maintain the tariff rates that they need to maintain the access to Europe for tuna exports from Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea got a small concession on tuna, which allowed for new exports of tuna, and Fiji was concerned to maintain its access to Britain for sugar exports. And so interim EPAs with those two countries, but the regional economic partnership agreement negotiations are effectively dead in the water. The European Union is trying to get better access to Pacific fisheries for the Spanish fleet, and the Pacific is saying, no, we have our own regimes for managing tuna, and they're at a stalemate, the talks. With Australia and New Zealand, Australia and New Zealand have unique geostrategic interests in the region. They're very keen to be seen by the world as unique insiders in the Pacific, and are key allies within the Pacific Islands Forum, for example. And so perhaps more open to the arguments coming from the Pacific trade officials that actually you need to design a unique agreement that really has our circumstances in mind. And Pacific Island countries, they were concerned about potential revenue losses and business closures arising from a WTO compliant trade agreement, given that a number of Pacific Island countries are reliant on imports, and a number of Pacific Island countries have been reliant on import taxes for their revenue sources. Australia and New Zealand, the negotiations have narrowed in terms of innovative things that might be added to a standard free trade agreement. They've narrowed to aid and labour mobility arrangements. And my understanding is that Australia and New Zealand have said that they will have an aid package that is tacked on to a PACE Plus, and there is in principle agreement on a labour mobility arrangement, a sort of a pseudo chapter that is connected with PACE Plus, but is not actually a treaty binding provision within PACE Plus. And we're in conclusion, don't know. The Office of the Chief Trade Advisor, which is currently represents the Pacific in negotiations with Australia and New Zealand, seems to think the negotiations will be concluded this year. But it's not clear. A number of Pacific ministers have said that they don't like the current terms of the negotiations. The Fiji Prime Minister has said that there needs to be more plus in the PACE Plus. The Trade Minister from Papua New Guinea has said that PACE Plus is a waste of time. So it's not clear whether the negotiations will be concluded this year. Labour mobility is critically important. I've only got a couple of slides left. Since 2007, and in large part in response to the Pacific's activism on the issue of labour mobility, New Zealand and then Australia have established and expanded schemes which allowing Pacific Islanders to work in rural industries. If anyone was in the talk yesterday focusing on labour mobility, we've seen that those schemes are growing. There's support for reform to those schemes to allow more Pacific Islanders to participate. As part of the PACE Plus negotiations, Pacific Island countries and Australia and New Zealand have an in-principle agreement to new regional arrangements, including an annual Pacific Labour Mobility meeting, which I think would be a useful thing to have, because it provides a forum each year for the labour departments amongst Pacific countries and Australia and New Zealand to consider the issues involved in labour mobility. The aim of this arrangement would be to enhance existing schemes and promote new mobility opportunities. There's a general consensus that labour arrangements are best dealt with outside of trade agreements, certainly for skilled and unskilled and semi-skilled workers. So even amongst trade policy wonks, there's a consensus that the managerial positions might be considered as part of a trade and services chapter in a trade agreement, but that other labour arrangements are probably best considered through bilateral labour arrangements. So it's not clear why this needs to be included in PACE Plus, this agreement that currently exists amongst the members now to have a labour mobility annual meeting. Finally, a cautionary tale from the Caribbean. So the Caribbean, they listened to the EU about how great a regional economic partnership with the EU would be, and signed up to an EPA in 2008. There's very recently a 5-year review, a joint 5-year review of that agreement, which found that the agreement had little positive impact. Trade with the EU had in fact contracted for most Caribbean states over that time. There had been some fiscal implications for some states. And just in May this year, the Caribbean Forum Secretariat issued a statement after a ministerial meeting to say, look, we felt that we were signing on to this because there would be windfall gains, but they have not been realised. So it's just a cautionary tale that the benefits of regime-compliant regional trade agreements are much oversold. So just signing something that complies with the WTO, with Australia and New Zealand, doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be an expansion in trade with those countries. I think the harder work is to think about what actually limits trade from island countries and to deal with those issues on a case-by-case basis. As far as trade tariffs go, even the most conservative of neoclassical economists understand that liberalising tariffs is best achieved on a rest of the world basis. This also allows countries to maintain policy control, less fiscal risk. With regards to tuna, this is my last slide, sorry. With regards to tuna, tuna is being dealt with under the parties to the Nauru Agreement, which is a whole other story, but it is a regional regime that is perhaps better suited to gleaning greater economic returns from the Pacific's tuna than preferential arrangements with parties like the European Union. With regards to sugar, it's no longer subject to the rules of the global trade regime because the EU unilaterally withdrew from the Lomé Convention Sugar Protocol. Labour mobility, as I said, increasing consensus best pursued outside of trade agreements and reviewed through annual meetings amongst the parties. So, I wonder if an awful lot of technical resources and political capital is dedicated to regional trade negotiations in the Pacific, but it's not clear to me that there are still fruit to be gleaned from that energy. So, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wesley. Our next presentation is on evolving trade and economic linkages between the Pacific and Asia.
Good morning. I am making this presentation on behalf of ADB's Economic Linkages team. So later I will give you a matrix of the list of consultants we have for this particular project. In 2015, ADB and ADB Institute published this book, Pacific Opportunities Leveraging Asia's Growth. So if you were lucky, you probably were one of the few who got hold of a copy yesterday, which was in our publications table. So given the the expected contribution of Asia in global growth by global output by 2030, there was really a need to harness opportunities for the Pacific that come with this particular growth in Asia. So this book explored the economic and financial integration opportunities within Asia for the Pacific. And in doing so, the book also identified the critical constraints with expanding this particular integration and made suggestions on how to mitigate these constraints. Now, as a follow-through to the project, ADB is now looking at evolving Pacific opportunities, particularly on foreign investments, financial investments, and direct investments. We have new export markets, growing tourism demand, overseas job opportunities, and migration. So this book is expected to be published by the end of the year, hopefully, by the ANU Press. So we are positive that with the continued work with our consultants, we'll be able to release this by the end of the year. So the project, again, Evolving Linkages in the Pacific, discusses broad trends in several areas of study. And to deepen the analysis, each chapter includes a case study that covers the market trend, institutional and policy developments. So the team leader for this project is Christopher Edmonds. There he is. I'm happy he's here, so maybe he could help me answer some of your questions later on. So our consultants, we have Patricia Surdin, who wrote a chapter on exports, so particularly on niche markets on pearls, cocoa, and vanilla. Cathy Sorin wrote a chapter on imports with case studies on food importation, fuel and manufactured products and machinery. And Jerry Phelan on tourism flows, and the chapter includes interesting case studies on Chuuk, Palau, and Saipan. There's John Gibson on labor exchanges, migration, remittances, so he also covered seasonal and permanent migration. Matthew Dolan on ODA, Official Development Assistance, with particular focus on budget support. And Ilan Noy covered, he wrote a chapter on finance, particularly on currency choice and international trilemma. So this presentation, it largely draws from the work of Patricia on exports. And it highlights some of the key trends and emerging opportunities within the Pacific. The data we present here covers ADB Pacific Development member countries, so they are listed at the bottom of that figure. So let me read them. There's Cook Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, FSM, Nauru, Palau, PNG, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. So if you look at that figure, the upward trend in total exports is clearly, it has been going up. So between 2003 and 2013, that's a 169% growth. But despite that growth in exports, the contribution to total exports in the world remains to be small at 0.5%. That's not surprising given the constraints on geography and transport costs that the Pacific, these small Pacific economies are faced with. And given the massive growth, we also see a significant variation across the Pacific economy. So here we highlight the top performers based on average annual growth from 2008 to 2013. So there's Tuvalu, Kiribati, and Timor-Leste, but note of course that Tuvalu and Kiribati, their contribution to total Pacific exports is quite small, at 0.3 and just 1% of total Pacific exports. For Tuvalu and Kiribati, their top exports are fish. For Timor-Leste, they contribute 6% to total exports. There's oil and gas and coffee. In the middle of the pack is PNG. The growth is average growth at 2.7% from 2008 to 2013 annually. And the growth, but despite that relatively small growth, it contributes 70% to total Pacific exports.
And it's pre-LNG.
Yes.
Yes. And in this particular,
The data sets.
you have shipments on LNG, which would push these exports moving forward. And the not so good performers, you have Nauru because of smaller shipments in phosphates and fertilizer, Palau, and Samoa with weaker exports on wire harnesses, cable, and fish products. In terms of major commodity groups, so here we select 3 countries, 93, 2003, and 2013. So there's an upward trend generally among these commodity groups. Now if we include PNG exports, the contribution of food and live animals is 17% by 2013. But if we take out PNG, which I mentioned a while ago, contributes 70% to total Pacific exports, the share of food and live animals goes up to as much as 38%. So that highlights the opportunity that this particular group of commodities presents for the Pacific economies. Now, where do Pacific exports go? It lists the major export destinations of the 14 economies. So there's Australia, New Zealand, and US remain to be the major export destinations. But you also notice within the list that there are several Asian economies, which indicates that the demand from Asia is actually growing. So moving forward, this is a market that Pacific economies could really tap. Now, here we show changes in Yield Comparative Advantage, or RCA. So with RCA, it's an indication of whether a particular Pacific economy has a comparative advantage on. So very simply, whether or not there is incentive for this particular, for a Pacific economy to focus on this product. So if you look at tables 2 and table 3, so all these commodities are commodities where these specific economies have RCA on. So RCA is greater than 1. However, there are specific commodities where RCA has declined. So for instance, in the third column, so there's weaker RCA if we compare their RCA score in 2013 versus 2002. For instance, in the Cook Islands, yes, they have comparative advantage, but it has declined in 2013 in terms for pearls. For Fiji, and the products have also declined. But notice that for most fish and aquaculture products and agriculture products, Pacific BMCs are actually competitive on. And specific niche products under this sector, such as pearls, vanilla, and cocoa, which will be mentioned later in the presentation, are recommended to be commodities where some of these economies could focus on. The chapter on exports with this publication also estimated a gravity model. So very simply, a gravity model tries to explain what drives specific exports. So using information on geography, historical ties, policy variables. In the beginning of the session, Manoj did mention about distance, remoteness, historical ties, that's colonial ties, which are, in the result, we find to be important. So the dependent variable in this model is the logarithm of bilateral exports. So we use data points or trade data between pairs of countries divided by the product of the country's nominal GDP, because in the basic gravity model, it mentions that the size of particular economies matter. In the independent variables, you have the logarithm of the distance between two countries. So the farther they are, then the less likely the trade is going to occur. And then you have colonial ties between countries and regional trade agreement. And I'm really happy that in the earlier two presentations, there was a lot of focus on RTA, these regional trade agreements. And in the results, I'm getting ahead of myself. The effect of RTA is really strong, which, well, of course, we already know that they're important, but here we have empirical data that really validate the work that we're doing. So let's look at the results. So this table shows spanning regression estimates for 4 years, 98, 2003, 2008, 2013. So this means that a regression equation was estimated for each year. So for distance, so clearly remoteness is a significant barrier to exports because of the negative coefficient. Now how do we interpret this? As an elasticity, so based on the results, a 10% increase in bilateral distance between two countries is likely to reduce exports by as much as 25 to 28%. So that's a very, very big impact on. But then of course there's really not much we could do about it, no? But as an aside, if we look at the value-added ad valorem shipping costs, in this chart you see there's been a volatility in trading costs. This includes, the information here includes both air transport and sea transport. There is volatility, but it's in a downward trend. And it's again, it's a positive. So, but this shipping costs are from the Pacific going to Australia, from Pacific going to New Zealand, from Pacific DMC going to the US. So these are average shipping costs. So the downward trend clearly present again an opportunity for Pacific countries to take advantage. But then of course, as we probably know, air transport is more common due to weak shipping connectivity within the region. Now RTA, it's positive and it's large. And the RTA here is a dummy variable. One means if there's an existing RTA, zero if it's done. And how do we interpret it? For example, in 2013, this one, the presence of an RTA is associated with an increase in trade of 734%, all else equal, if there is an RTA. So that's how strong the effect of having an RTA is. This we mentioned earlier, so you have this existing RTA agreements, Parteka, MSG, Melanesia, PATCRA, ICTA, and then there's ongoing PACER Plus negotiations. So hopefully, moving forward, we'd see more opportunities for collaboration between countries. Now for the niche markets, as I mentioned a while ago, for niche markets, this refer to, this is focus on high value, low volume commodities. And the strategy is to pursue brand recognition. And that is possible with production at the highest quality to penetrate foreign markets. So the contention is that Pacific DMCs can mitigate the constraint of remoteness and high trade costs by focusing on high value, low volume commodities. And given the limited size of most of the Pacific domestic markets, that growth prospects should ultimately be focused on penetrating foreign niche markets. So this highlights the important linkage of the export sector with domestic agriculture, aquaculture industries, and the tourism sector. So when the book is out, hopefully you get hold of it. And it highlights the specific strategies that Pacific economies could tap in order to take advantage of the possibility of building a niche market for their particular, with the domestic sector. So as an example of a niche market is the Pacific Pearl, primarily in Fiji. However, we know that there are other pearl industries in the Cook Islands, Tonga, FSM, PNG, and several others. Now, there is increased awareness, especially in the more developed economies, in terms of environmental issues and health concerns, which has heightened the demand for organic, sustainable products. So, in particular, so it means product certification, whether a particular commodity is organic, whether it's fair trade, or whether it comes from a particular origin, is highly valued. So in the Pacific, key examples of these agricultural products are vanilla and cocoa. So there's Vanuatu's vanilla and Spices of Fiji, as you know, which have successfully exported their products. So with a more intensive, stronger brand recognition, perhaps stronger marketing, there's more opportunity now to tap other export markets. So for cocoa, main producers in the Pacific are PNG, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Samoa, and Fiji. The international markets share for a high quality premium certified chocolate, which includes single origin, organic, and fair trade markets. It's expanding rapidly. And if Pacific economies take advantage of these high quality markets, there is opportunity to enjoy a significant premium. In the estimates is as much as 10 to 20%. So just to conclude, we've shown that regional trade agreements help promote inter-regional trade, and although Pacific exports are dominated by mineral fuels and fisheries, Pacific economies are encouraged to develop their niche products, so low volume, high value, premium niche agricultural products, high value aquaculture products such as pearls, and this highlights the need to strengthen exports linkage with domestic production and tourism, and to tap government institutional support, including official development assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. So before we move to question and answer session, I would request both the speakers.
Yes, mine was more of a comment really on to Dr. Morgan with regard to the point that was made about the report on the success of the CARI-Forum agreement. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was also a commentary in that report that reflected the fact that part of the lack of uptake was due to the lack of awareness raising and the lack of dissemination of information to the Caribbean businesses who were unaware of the opportunities that were available under the benefits of the agreement. So maybe for the Pacific, there's a lesson to be learned there in the amount of outreach, awareness raising, information sharing that can be done with your business communities and service providers. Don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah. I mean, by all means, this is apparently an issue is that people haven't in the Caribbean. That people in the Caribbean were not aware of any new opportunities that they might take up in the European market as a result of the Caribbean EU EPA. I think the comparison with, for example, PACER Plus is under PACER Plus under Spartica, the existing arrangements between the Pacific and Australia and New Zealand. Pacific Island countries already have duty-free and quota-free access for the vast majority of their potential exports. So, you know, the question is still, you know, I think it's always the case that there needs to be information dissemination about opportunities that are available. I mean, I think Ben's focus there towards the end on niche agricultural exports to growing middle class in Asia. I mean, I think there's lots of potential for you know, perhaps not huge industries, but for small enterprises that would be very important for linking rural communities in Pacific countries. So I think the point. The response is that I think that stands anywhere and everywhere at all times, that, you know, that one of the reasons why countries find it difficult to participate in trade is they're not aware of the opportunities available.
I can't say I'm trying to defend the Europeans' position because I'm British, so I'm probably not in a very good position to say I'm defending the EU's position.
Thank you for the presentation. My comment and question really is, in terms of the Pacific being better prepared to handle or to do the change that's coming. These are changes, the agreements are coming whether we like it or not. I like the point that Ms. Qalo talked about institutional strengthening and how important that is to development in the economy. And back to your point on redirecting resources, my question is what institutional strengthening, or where do we need to direct resources, or what institutions are needed for SVCs to strengthen SVCs' resilience and maybe put SVCs in a better position to negotiate or to be better prepared for these kind of changes coming forth?
Yeah, good question. You know, I think that the Pacific's intransigence in some of these negotiations has been a concerted strategy that has yielded some results. You know, under the EPA, for example, the Papua New Guinea secured a small concession that could potentially allow...
Can't hear you.
Right, okay, yep. Sorry. So I think that the Pacific's intransigence in these negotiations has been a strategy that has yielded some results. So you know, that in the EPA negotiations, the Papua New Guinea gained some unique concessions that may allow for new processed tuna exports to Europe. But really, you know, I don't see that there are gains commensurate with effort. So, you know, if it is about how you allocate your resources, I mean, for example, Stephen Howes had a suggestion yesterday about the Pacific Trade and Invest, which is, you know, we're based at the Forum Secretariat, but has offices in Auckland and Sydney and Beijing and in Europe, promoting exports from the Pacific. And he said that there should be an emphasis on exploring labour mobility opportunities through that institution, and that may be useful. I think that there is very much a need for a regional public good, a regional agency, perhaps based at SPC, that looks at quarantine issues for exports, for example, for niche agricultural exports, because I think that it's very difficult for all of the island countries to maintain the scientific expertise needed to meet the phytosanitary barriers for agricultural exports. And so I think it makes sense to have a standing regional pool of expertise that helps to facilitate agricultural exports. So they're the sorts of institutions that you might reassign your technical capacity to for expanding trade.
We were talking about the regional trade and agreements and efforts. Simultaneously, we have also got the sub-regional trade agreement, that is MSG, Melanesian, and there is some progress. The trade volume has increased between these intra-trade MSG in recent years, and we find the occasional irritants. Recently we had the goods from PNG into Fiji, and then it took some time to solve the problem, because the Fiji is aware that it is better to promote MSG rather than for some political reasons to answer to Australia and New Zealand, because that is the political economy part of the trade. How far you think sub-regional trade cooperation would be a factor in slowing down the bigger pacer? And Prime Minister, you referred to there should be more pluses than what they are today. That is one factor. Another, the China factor, which you haven't mentioned. There is a small reference into the Pacific opportunity to trade with China. Now is, in these things, 2013 you showed RTAs, but I think if you bring in the China influence, because they're also looking for free trade agreements on bilateral basis, and with PNG playing a greater role in China and PNG relations, do you think this is something like what Jagdish Bhavati said, the spaghetti and noodles all get confused on the plate? What do you see? Because you have done a lot of work in this area. You haven't brought the China factor there here.
Yeah, both excellent questions. And I don't claim to be an expert on all of the regional trade agreements, but the Melanesian Spearhead Group Trade Agreement and PICTA possibly do there is this argument that regional trade agreements are a stumbling block to broader liberalisation, and that's potentially true with regards to those agreements, insofar as my understanding is that Fiji has taken advantage of their access to neighbouring countries to expand beverages and noodles and biscuits and products from Fiji, and beer and cigarettes, and that there may be issues for Fiji if Fiji then, I mean, I don't really know the terms of the trading goods lists that are being talked about with Australia and New Zealand, but there may be issues if you're then liberalising with bigger parties. Would that have costs for Fiji for the expansion that Fiji's made under these sub-regional arrangements? And it's definitely a spaghetti bowl in the Pacific. There's this alphabet soup of regional trade agreements, and it's not clear that that's a particularly good outcome do that. Yeah, I mean, if there is a rationalisation of trade arrangements in the Pacific, that's probably useful. But again, is it the highest priority for your public policy? With regards to China, you know, I don't know about China pursuit of bilateral trade agreements with Pacific countries, but again, it's probably just as important to be pursuing those broader trade policy support. You know, how do you do some of the other things that do restrict trade? Like, for example, red papaya from Fiji. You know, it's some of the world's best. Apparently, it's Hawaiian pawpaw, but it's some of the world's best papaya. It's very sweet. It's now at a sort of standard size that consumers in developed country markets want. And when Fiji Air started flying to Hong Kong, they jumped on a plane and went up there and said, well, who wants to buy Fijian papaya? And apparently an awful lot of people do, because it's sweet and lovely, but there's only so much space on that plane, and there's only so many planes, and that's the key break on the export, not having a trade agreement with, well, in that case, Hong Kong. But if you follow, I think there would still be the broader constraints on trade would be equally, if not more important than an actual trade agreement with China.
Manoj. Hey,
I
co-author.
just wondered whether or not you, because I know you look at PACE Plus, whether or not you've had some thoughts about, or could share some thoughts about, what you think Australian and New Zealand investors are most interested in terms of services in Pacific Island markets. So I'm not really, sort of concerned about the goods, their issues there, but mostly what are their interests in terms of services. And it's hard to know what our trade officials are kind of already signing away on, or tentatively or whatever, or in principle agreeing to. But I understand, rather than the negative list approach, the positive list is actually one that protects more, because you only really say, yes, I'll open this, and everything else can be assumed to be closed, right? But if you go with the negative list, everything else would be assumed to be open, apart from what you've said you were not agreeing to. But I'm interested in what New Zealand and Australian investors, because that's really what trade agreements are about. It's about opening up markets for their investors. What are they really interested in terms of services in the region? Yeah, and I'm sorry that Veniana's left, because the only thing about the goods agreement that I would have liked to have asked her about is that she made a mention of it, but she didn't explain the implications of these mega agreements for instance, our access to medicines and pharmaceuticals. Is it about, it's intellectual property, but is it about an extension of the 20-year patent period, or is it about actually, well, it's linked. Is it about us not getting access to generic medicines anymore, because that's really the affordable medicines? Yeah, or is it about evergreening, this extension of patent periods beyond even the 20 years? So just, your thoughts about that?
What do Australian and New Zealand investors want in terms of a potential trade and services agreement with the Pacific? I don't know. I mean, there are Australian and New Zealand banks in the Pacific, Australian and New Zealand airlines that do a lot of business with the Pacific, Australian and New Zealand educational institutions that do business in the Pacific, Australian legal firms that are interested in doing business in the Pacific, potentially Australian and New Zealand healthcare providers. I mean, there's a whole range of private sector actors that may be interested in expanding into Pacific markets, but as to how sort of engaged they are with the trade negotiations, if any of them are tapping the negotiators on the shoulders, and if they have a list of things that they want to see to make it easier for them to do business in Pacific countries, I don't know, is the short version.
So,
yes,
sir, you finish?
Yeah.
So final comments I would like from
Okay,
Christopher.
thanks. Just sort of taking co-author privilege here, the reality that wasn't mentioned here is that the Pacific has a huge trade deficit in general. I mean, you're importing a lot more than you're exporting, and most of what is being exported is raw material resource exports. And so that's fueling a lot of good growth, but inherently it's growth that does not generate a lot of employment, does tend to generate a lot of inequality. So this is a great challenge, and this is why I think most trade analysts look at these areas of comparative advantage, because these are areas that actually absorb a lot of labor, tourism, niche agricultural exports. With all these things, although, we talked about the gravity model and the role of distance. Distance is there as a proxy for transport costs. If we could have good, accurate transport costs, that's what we get there. So we know transport costs really matter. So I think that's really, I guess, the grand enterprise and the grand cooperation between ADB and many of the Pacific governments is figuring out ways to bring those costs down. And I think one of those ways, a lot of that, so there's the hard infrastructure that we can build, and there's a lot of emphasis on that, but a lot of the more important innovations are on the soft infrastructure, and that's where I think some of Wesley's comments about sub-regional efforts to combine, phytosanitary compliance, and we see, I think it's happening on a small basis right now with Fiji returning to its role as a natural hub. So now we see an increasing amount of re-exports, especially to Kiribati and Tuvalu through Fiji. So I think this is an area of promise. So I think ADB does have an optimistic vision here. So that was a general comment I wanted to throw on. And these are exactly the issues that we're looking at in the Evolving Economic Linkages study. So we're actually looking at all these distinct sectors. And what we're really trying to do, in addition to looking at these broad trends, which is what Mr. Radoc focused on, is looking at cases of change and how do you bring about change, because there's a lot of a political economy, and how do you get coalitions for change. So studying these in very detailed case studies, that's sort of the role. So we really look forward to releasing the book, and we hope by next year we'll have copies to share with you all. Thank you.
So I think a couple of just final question.
Just a quick question. It's picking up on what Claire said and what's just been mentioned there, and it's for either Wesley or Benjamin, is do you think these mega free trade agreements are capable of meeting the human development aspirations of the populations of the Pacific? Because I'm reminded of a cautionary quote by the ex-Prime Minister of Jamaica, Michael Mann, and his country's encounters with FTAs and structural adjustment. And his quote was, "In whose interest? Just ask who set it up."
I think for rural families or rural households to be able to take advantage of these trade agreements would be whether or not they're able to participate in terms of exports. So that's why in the presentation that I just mentioned very quickly, that for them to be able to tap these rural families to be able to take advantage would be if they're part of the production process. Otherwise, then it just doesn't trickle down to their level.
Yeah. It looks like this session was very interesting and a lot of questions. So, but we have lunchtime. If you are still having questions, you can always catch them there. But thank you for attending this session. I hope this session was fruitful and it adds value in your knowledge base. So let's thank our speakers for today. Because I started with the economics textbook thing. In economics, more is not always better, and I'm not sure if it applies to number of agreements, how many agreements are active, what are their implications. I think in the Pacific region we need more evidence, and this is thought-provoking thing, and this will be a research question for you. With that, thank you so much for attending this session.
Yes.